Hello and welcome to the Event Plus activities of the Circular Economy at Harvard Symposium, where we'll be talking to the people making the circular economy happening, rethinking how we design, make, and reuse everything. My name is Sergio Jacinto. I am a healthcare manager and a candidate for sustainability transition management at Bologna Business School. With me today, I have Johanna Schiele, a public policy candidate at Harvard Kennedy School and German government McCloy Scholar. It is my great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker today, Sean Ansett. Sean is the president at Stakeholder Advisors and has over 20 years of experience providing strategic advice to corporations, social enterprises, and startups, UN agencies, and nonprofit organizations of circularity, responsible sourcing, and environmental sustainability. Sean was previously a co-founding team member and chief sustainability officer at Fairphone, the first modular and ethic smartphone company, head of responsibility sourcing at Apple, director of corporate responsibility at Burberry, and global partnership director at Gap Inc. He is currently a head board member at Cradle to Cradle Certified Product Standard, although he is not representing Cradle to Cradle here in this talk, but will give us his insight on Cradle to Cradle. Joanna?
Thank you so much for being here, Sean. As Sergio already said, you worked in April and consumer electronics and in other consumer products for over 20 years now, but always from a sustainability and circular economy perspective. So given how many different industries you've seen, what has changed most about circular economy approaches over time, and where do you see the concept today?
Great, thank you very much, Johanna. And first of all, it's a real pleasure to be with you all, unfortunately virtually, but hopefully we'll all get together soon and later in 2021 as things improve. Yeah, it's been quite a journey. As Sergio mentioned, it's been just over 20 years. And when I started in this world, I was very much focused on sort of more the compliance aspects, right? The nuts and bolts work, whether it related to environment, whether it was wastewater issues in garment manufacturing or labor and human rights issues. And I would say that, I've seen more traction, certainly over the last, I would say 5 to 7 years. And that was still, fairly early stages where there was more of an interest in product circularity rather than just sustainability, right? So really trying to move forward and question the system itself and how the system has been designed largely for a linear type of approach, right? And also many times heavily subsidized. And we haven't even gotten the linear approach done well in many countries. As you know, there are issues with even recycling today, right? So I think, maybe one way to frame this, early on in my career, we talked a lot about recycling, right? But we always forget about the other two words in the mantra, reduce and reuse. And I think that now we're seeing more of an interest there. Certainly this started in the built environment, I would say, where there was certainly more interest in the construction sector. I think a lot of these principles, people like Bill McDonough, who was an architect himself, that was his sector, and the suppliers to many of the building sites started thinking about circularity. Mm-hmm. So that we're still faced with this very challenging system, but I do see certainly more interest in product circularity than I have in the past. I think the number in Europe, it's something like 50% of raw material consumption in Europe is due to construction, and about 60% of waste, if I'm not mistaken. That's a UN statistic. So makes sense. It was a material issue for the industry, but now we're seeing products being developed in apparel and cosmetics, and something I'm very familiar with in consumer electronics, right? And you mentioned Fairphone, and mm-hmm. our purpose and intention, our design intention was to keep products circulating in the system as long as possible, right? So thinking about issues like durability, repairing, even sharing of products like phone leasing and so forth. So how do we keep these products in the system as long as possible? So I think it's an exciting time. And lately we've seen a lot more interest, certainly in the apparel sector in this area than I have in my 20 years in the industry.
Yes, I guess with a lot more thought and also a lot more public attention going into sustainability and circular economy, also comes the desire to measure these things more concretely and to be more specific about not just what is the concept of circular economy, but for specific products, how can I measure whether it's circular or not? And there, at the same time, we have these extremely globalized supply chains now, where each product has 100 or 1,000 countries or places of origin, and it actually becomes pretty complicated to measure all of that. So maybe as an intro question, how is the circularity of a product measured at all today? And what are the most common ways to do so?
Great, good question. Right now we're moving into from that reduce, reuse, recycle to the make, use, reuse, and remake, right? One obviously that I'm very familiar with, and you have flagged this up on, I'm on the steering committee of the Cradle to Cradle certified standard, one of the leading standards in the sector. And I encourage everyone to check out the new version V4, which was just released, I believe, just 2 weeks ago. And that criteria has been defined not only by the board and the institute itself, but by deep stakeholder engagement throughout the whole process. It was over a 2-year process to get to this V4 standard. So lots of insight, criticisms, ideation across various stakeholder groups in a variety of categories. So one would be material health, right? Is the product safe for use? Right? What are the materials? What sort of chemicals are used? Are there any banned chemicals? Right? So looking at that system, how can the product itself be used in current systems of reuse and remanufacture and so forth? Is it really set up for circularity? Does it have some underpinnings that are necessary to keep this in use in the system and cycle? Clean air and climate protection are important. That use of this, all of the air emissions related to the product, the energy efficiency use, the use of renewable energy and its production and so forth are also part of the standard. Water stewardship, inevitably you'll have to use water to make most products until we invent something fantastic in the future. Mm-hmm. And soil health, how is the product during its production process maintaining good soil health. Then there's a category we haven't touched on, social fairness, and there's a real upgrade in this V4 standard. How, as you mentioned, if you're manufacturing in multiple countries, multiple parts, I think an average smartphone has something like 1,000 components in it and well over 40 minerals in it. So that becomes quite complex. And how are workers making it in either the mines, extracting the raw materials, or in the assembly of let's say a phone or a TV or a computer? How are they treated? Are they treated with dignity and respect? Are their rights respected? The packaging, if you are using packaging, what sort of packaging is being used and how does that play into circularity? And also, which is missed and people don't often think about, animal welfare practices. So there are products within Cradle to Cradle that simply will not achieve certification because of abuses ongoing or not in certain industries or sectors relating to animal welfare. And you also have to look if the product is even eligible for certification. We don't allow certification, for example, of single-use plastics because they're not intended for ongoing continuous use. So those are a number of factors that need to be looked at. And one thing I will mention about Cradle to Cradle, this is a continuous improvement process, right? You start at a bronze certification, but you may meet a higher certification initially, but you're encouraged to reach platinum certification, which is really the best of the best in what the standard considers circular from a product perspective. And you're tested on that. You have to recertify every couple of years, and you have to continue moving up the ladder. And we really want to encourage that continuous improvement. I don't think a lot of people think about that, but it's a really important part of Cradle to Cradle is continuous improvement. But you are kind of forced to move up the ladder and not down the ladder.
Yeah, it's super interesting. I haven't thought about that actually. So some products will never actually even be eligible to be certified. That can also be very important in the distinction what products are more sustainable or not. So thinking about the certification in general, how important is a certification at this point to help move the circular economy forward? And how many certifications are out there? So Cradle to Cradle is, of course, one of the bases of the circular economy. How does it compare to others? What distinguishes it from others?
Right. Well, from my opinion, of course, it's much more robust than a number of the other certifications, because it's really looking at how are we doing more good, right? Not just less bad. And that's kind of a mantra from Bill McDonough himself, right? But really, how are we doing more good? And that's why it looks at all of those levels of detail. But certainly there are others. You know, there are eco labels that are issued by governments, right? You have Blue Angel, I believe, in Germany, for example, and there are others by country that are, you know, good, rigorous standards. These are important standards as well. But you really have to look at side-by-side comparisons about each aspect of circularity that is addressed. And there are certainly gaps in these certifications. We don't have the time to go through, you know, sort of an analysis of all the strengths and weaknesses. But I do think they're all playing an important role. I do think it's important if you're looking to certify a product, you know, what is your intention? Who is your end customer, right? All these matter because there are costs associated with certifications, right? And as a certification right for you? Fairphone, we're certified to Blue Angel, for example. But that was a deliberate, you know, decision because Germany was a very large consumer market for us. And that also then leads to, I think, your earlier question about procurement. You know, those are what government agencies are looking for, perhaps large companies as well, that they have some level of satisfaction, or at least know there's a baseline of what that certification is stating to you. I don't have the number, Sergio, just I think it'd be important to mention. We'd have to double check. I think there are still very, very limited products at a platinum level certified in Cradle to Cradle, because it's extremely difficult to get to. But that's really, you know, we want to be aspirational as well. And, you know, as the systems catch up, as material design catches up, then, you know, I think we'll see more and more of these types of platinum level certifications and others.
Yeah, sure. So we have to have also a structural approach and have a base to deal with, and also, like you said, for governance to reference. And that's really understandable, right? But how can you make the society and the economy at large understand the need for Cradle to Cradle products?
Yeah, always the silver bullet, right? It's a real challenge, certainly on, you know, consumer engagement, but the broader public at large. I think education very early on in school would be helpful. It's already happening. As you're aware, there has been now climate change education taking place for some years, and I think we're seeing the fruits of that. You know, Greta and others, and I think that's powerful. But I think it's more of a broader, not necessarily about product certification, but certainly about the circular economy and what that means, because it's only society like ourselves, all of us on the call and everyone watching, that can then call up their legislature and push for change. You know, that we want more investment. Perhaps it's regulation. Legislation can be helpful, right? Engineers love problems. Yeah. So, you know, let's give them a problem to solve. And that would be, how do we change our infrastructure to enable the circular economy? So one is legislation. The other is, let's invest in these areas. And we need politicians as well as private actors to invest in new approaches that will also enable circular economy. So if we can get that cohort of society actively engaged in this, then I think we'll start seeing change. But it's going to take that sort of political pressure over time. That answers your question.
Yeah.
I would also love to dig a bit deep into the question of what motivates companies to get certified, not just what makes consumers make these decisions. So from your experience, which type of companies go for certification? What's the benefits for them? And do you think it would, like if you had a Christmas wish list, do you think it would be useful to make this mandatory, like certification for food ingredients is in Europe, for example? Do you think there's a point for regulation to be made?
Yeah, great question. Certainly, I think some of the benefits are this, opportunity for procurement. If governments put some requirements around what type of products they will procure, and there are, but unfortunately, to be frank, a lot of these are nice to haves, but like other procurement organizations, often goes to quality and cost before these other factors are taken into place. So I think we could be more stringent there, and including your universities like Harvard as well, right? If they had criteria around this of how they procure UN systems as well. I mean, these are big purchasers of all sorts of products. So that's definitely incentive. I think the other incentive is differentiation and innovation, right? Offering something new to consumers. And that's also great institutional learning, right? Going through this process of certification, as we talked about engineers like these problems, but the designers who are making these products, the product developers and others, this is a great way to motivate your teams to see how they can execute with some of these requirements that are out there. And it also, for companies, brings goodwill from the employees, right? I think many of us that are participating here want to work for employers that share similar values to ourselves. And there's lots of data now that suggests that employees will take lower salaries. I think it's about 5 to 10% on most surveys for those companies that they feel they're aligned with. So that's a way to continue to attract and recruit the best and the brightest talent. So those are some definitely some advantages to companies to seek certification. But I think that's also why you saw the movement in the built environment first, because it was kind of an expectation. You're also having to go through a lot of municipal legislation as well, just to build the site. So, if you want to meet certain standards like LEED and others, you need to have this this content in your build outs. I hope I answered that. I may have missed one small piece if you want to repeat.
Yeah, maybe one aspect of it. Do you see companies pushing consumers more or consumers pushing companies more? Because obviously there's like a green bonus associated with green products, and one argument is that you can trade them at a surplus, so it's worth getting certification because, say, for green electricity you can sell it a bit more expensively, or for sustainable products there's like, that would basically be the case of consumers pushing companies. But then there's also these companies that really, like, they make the path, like who did we have? Harald Tettner. We interviewed him. They're basically renting out like all sorts of medical equipment, and that's really like front edge of what's happening. So what's your view on this?
Yeah, unfortunately, I think we need more trailblazers. I wouldn't wait for the consumer. I wouldn't. There have been some certifications. These, I wouldn't call these, of course, circular certifications. But if you look at the fair trade movement, some of that was driven certainly by consumers, right? It actually started in the US, at least, through faith-based organizations, right? This connection to poverty and so forth, and peer pressure, right? So, members of different denominations would pressure their peers to, what kind of coffee are you drinking at home, right? And are you thinking about the workers that are harvesting it and so forth, with the co-ops? But in these other ways, I think that it's not consumer driven largely yet. I think that you're certainly cutting edge as well, holding a conference and seminars on this particular topic, because if you talk to people generally, there's not great awareness. I think there certainly is more in Europe than there is in the US, but largely people wouldn't really understand what we're discussing. So I think companies need to lead, and those leading companies, the edgy companies, as you mentioned, someone you had interviewed, and others that are emerging, they're gonna blaze a path forward. And I think what's exciting is, we talked about education before. Many of the designers who are in design schools, right, at university level, in the top design schools, now they're running their own departments, or they've started their own brands and companies. And I think they are taking this design intent with them, that they don't want to do harm and they want to do more good. And that's why we're seeing more of these products come to market. And then it's up to the brand if they want to, pay for the certification, or simply, sell it to the consumer that way. I think that, at some point consumers are going to want, I think Sergio mentioned data, going to want to see, is there real teeth behind what the company's claiming, right? How do I know that they're telling me the truth? And that's what, a certification can provide to that type of consumer or analyst.
Going a little bit into how we actually are going to get things done. Will cradle-to-cradle certification start implying that we will have to have a circular due diligence, like there is also a financial due diligence when you access investments, for example? Will this start to be a new notion for companies developing new products?
Yeah, it's a super interesting question, right? And due diligence is certainly on the rise. Whether you're talking about ESG, we've talked about it for 2 decades, but I'm seeing more teeth now, and investors taking it more seriously than in the past. And you've seen now legislation in Europe on mandatory due diligence, whether it's in your supply chain, on labor, human rights issues, or other environmental factors. So it's certainly on the rise. Yes, absolutely. And remember that, Cradle Cradle and most of these standards, you'd have to look at them individually. They're not all equal. There are auditors that do all of that due diligence work. So they're approved by the certification body to then do the work on the due diligence, looking at those specific categories, right? So, cycling, material health, and so forth. So there is oversight to that process before a certificate is handed out. I think you're also alluding to things like the circular passport, right, which we really do need in the built environment and elsewhere. This is a real opportunity. If we're going to reuse these products that are in buildings, people need to know what products are there, the integrity of those products, when they were put there, throughout the lifetime of that product. I mean, the components that are used, right? So that when that building is being turned into something else, perhaps, what happens a lot in the built environment? You have a company that occupied an office. The building's perfectly intact, right? There's no structural integrity issues. It's very usable, for decades and decades and decades. However, the interior of the building's not my color, right? It's not on my brand. So let's just chuck out all the carpeting and the ceiling, and gut it. Well, if we had a material passport, you could then alert other builders, designers, whomever, that these materials are used. Here is all the information about the contents of that particular product, how it's made, where it came from, and that it's available to then be used somewhere else. So I think that's going to be important. And the oversight of that's going to be really critical, right? If we, I'm sure you've talked a bit about blockchain and other technologies to, trace and verify that the claims are correct. And there are issues within blockchain, as I'm sure you're aware, but it is one tool that we have that's better than what we've had in the past. And we need to start implementing those types of technologies, as well as oversight and governance mechanisms for things like a material passport in the future. That's going to be really important. And consistency, right? Because as we've seen with like codes of conduct in the past, right, on labor and human rights issues, now we have this plethora of codes of conduct, right? Companies have their individual codes, and you have different initiatives with different codes. Let's see if we can land on a material passport. Maybe the EU would be a great place to start there. That would at least would cover the EU as such a large market, where there's consistency in what's expected in that passport, how it's governed, to ensure that the data is reliable going forward. That would be a huge improvement going forward.
So the responsible body. So as you spoke, we have so many new entities coming out for circularity and circular schools of thought that's still developing. Also for sustainability, that actually governance is really a big issue, right? Where we stand, where is our base? So it really should come from a bigger institute, right? To lead the way. We have those kind of certifications for products, but still, even the definition is still a very very incipient starting, right? So even recently, France just legislated about having a mandatory repairability index. Should that be, for example, something that should be included in a product passport also?
Yeah, I would say absolutely. And it'd be good to see that we have some examples like the French legislation. Let's see how it rolls out, what kind of impact it has. And rather than recreating the wheel again, maybe that is something that could move through the EU and see if other member states were interested to, again, drive this consistency. Otherwise, we're going to have one by country, like we've had in the past. And that at some point becomes ineffective, then companies would be having to look at multiple certifications again. So anyway, we can drive that consistency. But what I'd also say, though, is in that governance structure, maybe it's not just governments at the table, right? Government has a seat at the table, but then civil society, perhaps academia, others are on a rotating board where they're, one, making sure that they're staying abreast of changes and developments, innovation that's taking place. Two, that they're a check the checker to make sure that there's good integrity in the standard and how it's rolled out, how companies get certified, right? That whole process is in place. And then they can also manage any complaints, right? So an individual, civil society actor, whoever, if they feel a certification was handed out that was not appropriate, or a passport, that there's some sort of complaint mechanism that's, again, reviewed by this board and actions taken to address any irregularities and so forth. So I think we need to look at some new forms of governance and involve other actors, not just government actors, not just private sector actors, but other actors in that process.
Sean, would it make sense to have different kind of passports? Because at the end of the day, you will have so much information that people can't even tackle or understand. So would it be interesting to have separate passports for industry, consumers, or just an overall passport?
It's a good question. I'm not sure. I think you want to simplify as much as possible, but obviously the passports may look different depending on product type or sector, right? So I think that needs to be considered, right? Buildings are, generally built to last decades or more, where, a t-shirt isn't necessarily, but we are trying to keep this circulating. So there'll have to be some tweaks, and there may be sector specific, like the, Global Reporting Initiative has sector specific reporting requirements. There are different issues, there are different materials. So, but I wouldn't want to get away to have all these, separate passports that could become quite confusing, to consumers as well as institutions. That would be my initial take on it, but I haven't looked deeply into that question.
You touched on it earlier, and I would love to go a bit deeper into technologies that you're excited about on how we can actually get all this measuring done, because ultimately we're talking about thousands and thousands of products here with very long value chains, and having like a research team doing the whole value chain analysis for all of these products might not be the most feasible. So are there any technologies that you're really excited about and that you think came up in recent years to really help standardize this process and help to make it more feasible for like large amounts of products?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's been a lot of attempts at big data. You probably are familiar with SourceMap and some others. I think they're actually based in Boston, if I'm not mistaken. The other school, MIT, but that's quite interesting. It can be quite expensive, but that has provided certainly more visibility. There's BanQ, which is a blockchain technology, but certainly driving lower cost. And you can use this via a dumb phone rather than a smartphone platform. So this really enables local stakeholders to participate more directly at lower costs with the technology that they currently have. So you can track that mechanism, including payments to those suppliers, or even an individual farmer who might be selling, who knows, coffee or even cobalt, a miner in the DRC. So that's quite interesting, because that's bringing the cost down, and it's also appropriate technology to meet those stakeholders at really upstream, where, as you say, it gets fragmented and quite opaque and very challenging to track and trace these types of materials. So I think those are two examples. And then there's a technology I'm not familiar with exactly what it's based on, but I believe it's looking at issues like proteins and so forth. And basically you can then determine what country, what farm, what mine, wherever, what forest you're actually, you've taken that product from. So then later, it's still quite expensive, but I think that, as it scales, the cost will go down. And that technology, I think, is going to be very promising, because you can never then make a claim that if it came from the Amazon rainforest, but you've made a claim that it's come from somewhere in sub-Saharan Africa, that goes right down to the basic material of how the biology behind that particular material. That gets very exciting. I can't remember the name, but maybe we can flag it up after to the other participants.
Yeah, super interesting. Again, I hadn't heard about that before. That reminds me of kind of a genetic testings that are where we can actually find where we come from also. So that would be kind of similar. Thinking still in a broader scope, considering or the circular passport or whatever certification that's going to be trendy in the future or important as a baseline, which areas or which industries would it be more important to address in an early stage that would have more impacts in the environment, socially?
Yeah, I think certainly environmental, on the environmental side, it's going to initially have the most impact, because you are then able to identify this product and or component and know where it's ready to go. How can you use this in, let's say it's a building, into a new construction project or into a new product. So that's going to take a lot of burden off the planet to make it easily identifiable to reuse. But there certainly, we haven't gotten into this topic, but and you've probably seen quite a bit of the reporting, there are some challenges to employment, right, in the future with circular economy, as we're moving away from just make, take, waste model, which is great for employment largely, to reusing products. It will provide new opportunities, and there's going to be opportunities for reskilling people. And I think you may have addressed this on one of the other seminars, so I won't get into great detail, but there could be some significant impacts to employment and job opportunities on the social side. And I think generally, many of these standards have focused more on environmental circularity, if we want to call it that, as opposed to social circularity. And I'd like to see some more rigorous criteria developed for the other good standards that are certainly out there, that they're including labor and human rights in the standard, not just product or environmental circularity. That's needed.
Could it have an opposite effect? Thinking a little bit of an impact that a certification of a product passport that'll direct impact it will have on a business. Could it alter significantly the way a business is conducted? And it couldn't have a perverse effect, for example, to create barriers, entry barriers in markets for small business?
It certainly could. I think there's always a risk with, generally just certifications in general, right? Going back to 2 decades of work, who's the auditor, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who's doing the oversight work? There have been issues, right? In fair trade and SA 8000, human rights standard and others of abnormalities or problems, right? Depending on who's actually conducting the kind of, I'd say, the boots on the ground due diligence.
Mm-hmm.
It can help innovation, as we talked about earlier, right? Wanting to tackle those problems and having some parameters to do that, knowing your goalposts. But yeah, it could also hinder innovation and potentially block smaller emerging brands that cannot pay for the cost of certification or burden themselves with that process at a particular stage. So certainly can have that effect, but I generally see this as overall positive, because the whole industry will then be moving in a more uniform direction, and it's going to create more opportunities to identify those products quickly and know where they need to go to continue cycling them in our system. So I think that will outweigh, but you're certainly correct, there will be some negative impacts for emerging brands and other players.
Getting towards the end of the conversation, I think I would like to open it to a slightly broader topic again before we wrap up. In general, sustainability has become such an important issue, and the SDGs are being used a lot as a framework to assess what is sustainable. Do you see a bit of a trade-off between the ambition to be holistic, but also the need to be specific? Because in the SDG, so many topics come together. It's about labor rights, it's about water, it's about wildlife, it's about climate change. There's all this stuff that certainly is all connected to sustainability, but at the same time, really specifically measuring all of these impacts is very hard. I mean, looking at what banks are doing at the moment to assess the SDG compatibility, it's brushing the surface at best. So do you think there's a way that we can have both the holistic approach and the specificity needed to actually make this transparent?
Yeah, it's a great question. I like the overarching framework of the SDGs. Certainly it sets kind of a North Star and how business, government, civil society is going to try to tackle and meet these goals. So that's really important. And I really see them as an opportunity for cascading down, right? So, this is our overall, and wherever you sit in the supply chain, you have a role to play in meeting that goal, because you'll have to work closely with your suppliers, regardless of what product you're making or service you're providing, right? I'm just taking it from a private sector approach. You'll need all of them also meeting that goal. I think it's fascinating. I did some advising for a food company a couple of years back, and they were, they were doing great work, but they didn't have much of a program. And it wasn't until the brands that they were supplying, so they were supplying ingredients, right, to the big CPG players in the world. It was that they were then cascading down because they had to meet the SDG. Hey, what are you doing? And what clicked for the owner and chairman of the board when we were having a discussion about change and transformational change was, this is a new way for you to help your end customer, right? So it's not just about the quality of your ingredients, the price, and all the other factors that come in business, but also helping them meet these objectives. And that transformed their whole program. So I think it can be very powerful. And as you know, when you're looking at the overarching goals, you're gonna be able to help in certain areas. So you can get very specific that I'm actually gonna land on water, but it's either not relevant to what I'm producing, right, from a materiality perspective, or I can really impact on this particular area, and that's where I'm going to set all my other metrics. So as long as folks are setting metrics to measure themselves rather than words, and they're going to, one, have performance-based targets internally, also externally, and report on their progress, I think there can be quite exciting. And as you alluded to, that's where you can get in the real specificity rather than the overarching goals and objectives.
So we have the SDGs to provide us a guidance for a sustainable development, and we have to develop towards the planetary boundary framework that's now been expanded into the donut. So we now contemplate the social dimension also, so which is a great framework. But for me, the biggest drawback it has, and you spoke about us also, I believe, briefly, is downscaling it, because it's still a big approach, right? It's not very specific. The circular economy there, as a way to get there, is more specific, as are certifications. How do you think we can go about downscaling the planetary boundaries and more the SDGs to the point to be more useful for businesses?
Well, we could spend a whole hour on that alone.
Yes.
Great question. But I think Kate Raworth's model is very, very helpful framing. I don't, just from a visual perspective, and certainly from a legislature, right? So a government, it helps them think about policy development and how if they're going to use the donut, how they're going to fit that in, and what areas of both environmental and social they'll need to focus on, of course, to make that happen. So I think that framing is really helpful, framing to people from a government perspective. But I think over time, companies are going to better understand how they fit in there. There's still so much work on SDGs, and I think they're totally interrelatable. I don't think it's creating much confusion. But I do think it sort of sets a North Star of what we should be aiming for in our policy development, perhaps even choice editing, right? I think government can play a role in saying, sorry, these products just aren't acceptable anymore. I think France is touching on that with the repairability index. We'll have to see how it actually rolls out and what kind of impact it has. But it's a way of using policy to create change. And you can see how that might fit into the donut as well.
Sean, thank you so much. Are there any last thoughts you want to leave our listeners with? If not, I will wrap it up. Yeah,
I'll just say something really, really quickly. One, thank you everyone for joining us. It's been an honor to be with you all. And I'm more optimistic than I have ever been. I think there's real momentum. I think there's some transformation taking place. And I think it's exciting times. And all of you have a role to play in this great transformation. I just feel that the motor's revving up, and we're going to drive this forward in big ways. So I think COVID has taken, people have been able to sit back, think perhaps a little bit more than they have in the past. And it's also exposed inequalities in our society and the like. And I think certainly that reflective period is going to bring more change going forward. So once again, thanks so much for having me.
Oh, thank you. It was great to have you. So for anyone listening now, you can find this video and previously recorded videos, interviews, and events on our website. That's circular@harvard.org. We've previously hosted interviews with Harold Tepper, and now I'm also remembering his company, which is Philips, and Anna Carolina, the Global Head of Communications and Sustainability at OLX, amongst many others. We would also love to invite you to our next event, which is taking place on April 15th. And we will be talking about how to reduce building material waste. So probably also touching on material passports. And you can sign up to that event via our website or on LinkedIn. And with that, I wish you all a good week and hopefully see you soon.
Thank you, Sergio. Thank you, Joanna. Take care.
Thank you so much, Sean.